Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Irvin D. Reed, Director of the African Democracy Project and the Forum on Contemporary Issues in Society here at the university. And first, I want to say on behalf of the Office of International Programs, which actually is responsible for International Education Week here at the university, I want to say welcome on behalf of its director. And the director is at another campus at the moment, so I'm doing it on his behalf. International Education Week, as you know, is something that started some 15 years ago, an initiative of the U.S. Department of State and the Department of Education, really to try to engage American students in a better understanding of things worldwide that have to do with problems and interests that are mutual across national borders. So there are challenges and there are opportunities, and the State Department wanted the university to be the place where those great discussions actually took place. For many years, the African Democracy Project here at Wayne State, which started in 2009 with the first group of students that went to Mozambique, really gave our students and faculty an opportunity to engage in at least observing democracy in another country. So the students were there during the election of 2009. That's in Mozambique. I also felt, however, that democracy itself cannot be defined simply by saying you have elections. It has to be something which, as a result, benefits the people of that country. Otherwise, it's simply an abstraction and irrelevant. And for that reason, it's important for our students to examine democracy around the world, and particularly in the case of the ADP program in Africa. We believe that for democracy to work, it has to do four things. One, it has to provide an opportunity for people to select their leaders. It has to provide for the general welfare in areas such as health, education, the economy, the pursuit of happiness. It has to provide for the security for the nation and for the institutions of the nation. And lastly, it has to provide for opportunity for economic advancement and for prosperity of its people. Now, these happen to coincide with the four aspects of democracy that many people agree on. Even if they turn out to be three or four, it usually will contain those elements. In 2005, 8 of 10 people surveyed worldwide by the Gallup poll identified democracy, despite its many problems, as the best form of government. But to quote Kofi Annan, which all of you know, no nation is born a democracy. There are many challenges along the way. For example, democratization often begins to emerge in totalitarian countries that strenuously resist any change whatsoever, especially when it would result in the sharing of power. And it often has been the unfortunate opinion in Western politicians that encouraging economic prosperity was actually more important than democracy. So let's hold off on democracy and let's just focus on economic prosperity, excuse me. Historically, many democracies have had violent births. Naturally, the first that comes to mind is the American Revolution. But few countries have made such a relatively smooth transition from oppression to government by and for the people as this one, we were fortunate, eventually did. The problem is that after such upheavals in the name of democracy, many countries emerging from violence historically have sought reconstruction, economic revival, and a return to stability well before the establishment of democratic institutions. No matter how hard these were fought for, whether they were in civil wars or in struggles or wars of insurrection or whatever, they always seem to be willing to put off the establishment of the democratic principles. In such cases, real democracy, though the spark that ignited the revolution, may wind up being postponed indefinitely. One might think about modern-day Russian Federation. In Africa, we have lately seen revolutions in Egypt and Libya, but true democracy still eludes those nations. Elsewhere in Africa, the emergence of democratic government has often been an arduous process, but that evolution frequently has been fortunate to have strong leadership. Among these dedicated leaders have been President Pedro de Brona Rodrigues Pereira of Cape Verde, President Festus Mogae of Botswana, President Joachim Chissano of Mozambique. Some of you may recall that President Chissano actually participated in the African Democracy Project Focus Lecture in 2010. In Namibia, the War for Independence began on August 26, 1966, when guerrillas of Southwest African People's Organization, short, we'll say SWAPO, attacked South African government forces. August 26 is still a public holiday in Namibia, corresponding after a fashion to the 4th of July. I talked privately to our guest speaker today about this, and the best way to remember that is that's the day the first bullet was fired. And that's when the revolution actually began. Although the war formally ended in 1988, Namibia did not finally gain independence until March of 1990, when SWAPO won a majority of seats in the National Assembly, allowing them to form a government. And the students enrolled in the African Democracy program here at Wayne State this semester will be in Namibia during that holiday and during the inauguration of the next president in March of 2015. So those of you who did not enroll in the course on Namibia, sorry, you will not be going along, but we'll send you pictures of that great event. It's a great opportunity for students here at Wayne State. It'll be the 5th class of students that will have studied in Africa, some aspect of its democracy. Our guest today is intimately familiar with the determined but sometimes halting and painful process that led to democracy in Namibia. Martin Anjaba is now Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Republic of Namibia and is accredited to the Bahamas, Canada, Mexico, and Panama. Before Namibia gained independence, Ambassador Anjaba went into exile in 1977 and joined the ranks of the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, the military wing of the Southwest Africa People's Organization, SWAPO. He served for 5 years as senior coordinator at his party's provisional headquarters in Luanda, Angola. In 1989, he was repatriated to Namibia and appointed chief of protocol. Prior to assuming his present position, Ambassador Anjaba was Namibia's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. From 2006 to 2010, he was head of the Department of Multilateral Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I might point out that the ambassador is accompanied today by the first secretary of the embassy in Washington, D.C., O'Brien Samasiku. Mr. Samasiku, please, thank you very much for being here with us. In a high point of service to his country, the ambassador represented Namibia on the UN Security Council, serving as president of the council in 1999 and in 2000. He also was a member of the Security Council mission to the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, Uganda, in helping to resolve the conflict in the Congo. Ambassador Anjaba earned diplomas from the United Nations Institute for Namibia in Lusaka, Zambia, and the UN Institute in Training and Research, as well as a professional certificate in diplomacy at the Foreign Service Academy of Nigeria. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Anjaba.
Wayne State University is a highly respected and renowned institution nationally and internationally. Hence, I am gratified by the honor and opportunity to join you here and share with you a topic that is pertinent to Africa's future. Today, I will talk about the emergence and challenges of democracy on the African continent in general, and my own country, Namibia in particular. The emergence of democracy in Africa started during the decolonization period, when liberation movements in Africa fought for independence and self-rule. The decolonization of Africa followed World War II, as colonized people in Africa unwaveringly fought for independence. However brutal colonial powers were on our people, I can proudly state that the African people did not submit to colonial subjugation and exploitation, but rose up in arms to resist colonial occupation through Pan-Africanism. Visionary Pan-Africanists in the diaspora, among them W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, C.L.R. James, and Marcus Garvey, advocated for African self-determination with the motto, Africa for Africans, and African solidarity and unity, which paved the way towards the intensification of political resistance against the colonial occupation of the African continent. When Ghana achieved independence in 1957, it was a milestone moment for Africa. Many of us were inspired by this development. It instilled a sense of hope that one day the rest of Africa would be liberated, free from colonialism and oppression. Indeed, our resolve to liberate ourselves was strengthened. Ladies and gentlemen, it is important to emphasize that from the time that many African countries achieved independence in the 1960s, African leaders have always been initiating and establishing democratic institutions themselves. 51 years ago, in May 1963, the leaders of 32 independent African states gathered in Addis Ababa, the capital city of Ethiopia, and signed the Charter of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU. These African leaders were, among others, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, Modibo Keita of Mali, Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria, and Sékou Touré of Guinea. This historic signing resulted in the establishment of the OAU with the objectives of freeing our continent from the remaining vestiges of colonialism and apartheid, promoting unity and solidarity among African states and peoples, coordinating and intensifying cooperation for development, and promoting international cooperation within the framework of the United Nations. In the intervening years, the people of Africa fought and won the struggle against colonialism and apartheid. Thus, in order to provide new direction to our collective resolve or collective efforts and to face the developmental challenges more effectively, the OAU was transformed into the African Union in 2002. The birth of the African Union brought new hope to millions of Africans who have faced difficult living conditions because of conflict. Through the African Union, African leaders have vowed to continue strengthening democratic governance in Africa and respect for human rights. The leaders are driven by clear goals and objectives to bring about a new era where all Africans can enjoy socio-economic prosperity, peace, and security. Notable changes in the political landscape of the continent have taken place during the last 2 decades, with democratic elections becoming the norm. demonstrating Africa's collective commitment to promoting a political culture based on legitimacy, inclusion, and accountability. Indeed, African leaders understand that adherence to good governance and the enforcement of democratic institutions are closely linked to the sustainability of peace and development in Africa. In this regard, the leaders are strongly committed to building societies that are inclusive, democratic, accountable, and tolerant, and also respect human rights and manage diversity, taking into account each nation's specific characteristics and traditions. In any democratic system, there are challenges, and Africa is not immune. I would agree with some level of inference that, yes, there are democratic challenges in Africa. It is important to observe that while progress has been made to ensure seamless political transitions and democratic governance in Africa, the process of nurturing and consolidating democratic systems remain a daunting task. Equally, strengthening democratic governance structures, building democratic institutions, and the capacity of the states to manage political and economic processes are major challenges for many African countries. Unfortunately, these are historical problems because democracy in Africa is only viewed through the acute microscope of Western democracy. And regrettably, in our haste to democratize, and also cunningly as a condition for Western aid, we copied and adopted the Western form of democracy and neglected to build upon our own democratic traditions. In his article entitled "Why Western-Style Democracy is Not Suitable for Africa," George Aite, an African scholar, argued that Western-style multi-party democracy is possible, but not suitable for Africa. There are two forms of democracy. Democratic decisions can be taken by majority vote, which is the Western form. This has the advantage of being transparent, fast, and efficient. But the downside is that it ignores the minority positions. The alternative is to take decisions by consensus. This has the advantage of taking all minority positions into account. A similar observation was made by Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, the founding president of the Republic of Zambia, who gave an example of how democracy worked in ancient Africa. He said, and I quote, "In our original societies, we operated by consensus. An issue was talked out in solemn conclave until such time as agreement could be achieved," end of quote. The point here is that just because a group does not take its decisions by voting does not mean they have no understanding of the essence of democracy. Part of the wrong perception in the West about bad governance in Africa is that more often than not, studies on democracy in Africa are negative. What is not made clear is that it is a challenge for leaders in Africa to always implement Western democratic principles that may require stringent measures and turn out to be costly. Implementation is gradual, and budgetary constraints can delay certain programs. It should be noted, however, that countries in Africa are trying their best to democratize. Hence, democracy in Africa should be presented in a positive manner. When news is negative, it affects all forms of democratic accommodation and encourages antipathy towards the West. What is not known to the world is that African people are united against foreign interference. In most cases, castigating African leaders on the continent only bolsters resentment by the citizens towards opposition parties in the country in general and to the Western world in particular. What I'm trying to expound here is that external interference in the affairs of any sovereign state is not the panacea to addressing the problem. External involvement only exacerbates the problem. Thus, I should stress that external interference is a challenge to solid and inclusive democracy in Africa. For the information of this audience, when nationals are fed up with a leader, they will vote or force that leader out. And this has happened in many African countries. Ladies and gentlemen, it is unfortunate that Africa is still being referred to by some as a dark continent. Africa is not a dark continent. Africa is not a hopeless continent. Africa is a dynamic continent. In like manner, the terrible analysis of Africa as one country and not of 54 independent nations impairs all efforts for the continent to be a shining example of hope in the world. There is hope for good governance in Africa. We completely understand that good governance consists of the traditions and institutions by which authority in a country is exercised consistently and objectively. This includes the process by which governments are elected, monitored, and replaced, and the capacity of the government to effectively formulate and implement sound policies. It is worth noting that African countries have committed themselves to the institutionalization of democratic governance, individually and collectively, through regional and continental bodies. More work has been done at the continental level, where the African Union has led the course for inclusive democracy in Africa since its inception. Africa has made great efforts in creating mechanisms for the advancement of democracy and good governance. In this regard, the African Union launched the African Governance Architecture. The African Governance Architecture is a policy approach aimed at defining the necessary norms, institutions, and processes that facilitate policy and program governance, convergence on governance amongst the AU member states. The following are the main institutions that comprise the African Governance Architecture. The AU Commission, that is the Secretariat. the African Court on Human and People's Rights, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the Pan-African Parliament, the Secretariat of the African Peer Review Mechanism, the Economic and Social Council, the Economic, Social and Cultural Council, the AU Advisory Board on Corruption, and the regional economic communities. It should be commended that the AU launched this governance architecture as a dynamic and evolving mechanism, which is well positioned to play a key role in promotion, protection, and sustenance of democracy and human rights on the continent. At the regional level, various regional communities have put up structures that advance participatory democracy and good governance. The Southern African Development Community, SADC, for example, is striving to achieve not only economic but also political integration of its 15 member states on the basis of democratic principles. The region has made tremendous strides towards multi-party democracy, democratic governance. In an effort to prevent failed states in the SADC region, the SADC Organ on Politics, Defense and Security Cooperation was launched with a mandate to support the achievement and maintenance of security and the rule of law in the region. The organ's overall objective is to promote peace and security within the SADC region. In most cases, this can be achieved by preventing, containing, and resolving inter- and intrastate conflicts by peaceful means. The organ also has a mandate to assist member states in the development of democratic institutions and practices and encouraging observance of universal human rights. As Africans, we are fully aware that undemocratic systems lead to instability. Indeed, we prefer stability, which we know requires that all states be guided by strict adherence to the rule of law, good governance, people's participation in public affairs, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and the establishment of political organizations devoid of any sectarian, religious, ethnic, regional, and racial grounds. We acknowledge that the promotion of political pluralism or any other form of participatory democracy and the role of the African civil society, including enhancing and ensuring gender balance in the political process, are essential elements for building a representative and stable government and can contribute to conflict prevention. We also acknowledge that the African youth play an important role in the promotion of democracy through civic participation, electoral participation, and by providing a political voice to many other young people on the continent. Thus, the youth need to be empowered to be more effective in the promotion of sustainable democracy and economic development in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa has often been blamed for weak democratic institutions, lack of good governance, and corruption. There is a pervasive perception by African partners, especially in the Western world, that not much has been done in the area of democracy on the continent. The democratic process in Africa has taken different turns and trajectories in different countries with different levels of progress. while elections have become more regular and other components of liberal democracy relatively improved compared to the situation 2 decades ago, the quality of democracy and governance continue to improve in many countries rather than worsen. I hope lectures like this one today present a good opportunity to explain Africa's experiences and attempt to change the narrative. One point to emphasize is that even the countries that gained their independence way back before African states did, their quality of democracy is not perfect. What I'm trying to say is that it should be understood that the situation in Africa is work in progress, as is elsewhere in other parts of the world. Although we have consolidated our democratic institutions, we still need time, and that African realities have to be factored in order to have a homegrown democratic system compatible with local norms and historical traditions. Democracy from the African perspective needs to be developed from within, based on each nation's specific needs and conditions. It should be aimed at empowering diverse ethnic, linguistic, religious groups and make them participants, active participants, in shaping their own destinies. It should be noted, ladies and gentlemen, that the United States of America plays an important role in the promotion of democracy in Africa. But that role should be transparent, unbiased, and consistent. It is thus important to further strengthen the US-Africa relations. This relationship is good and important for democracy and development in Africa. I am pleased to say that the United States and Africa enjoy long-standing and deep historic, cultural, political, and economic relations. Namibia, too, has excellent relations with the US. The US has been a vital development partner for the continent, and the US investment and assistance have played a very important role in helping African countries build a better future. Assistance through the Peace Corps volunteers, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the MCC, are highly appreciated by several countries in Africa, including Namibia. The US sees the African continent as strategically important to its security and prosperity. The US, which has critical national security stakes and economic interests in Africa, has reaffirmed its commitment to building a new dynamic partnership that can help Africa overcome the various challenges it confronts. We are pleased that the US believes that the African Union is an important actor in the promotion of peace and stability, as well as the advancement and protection of the principles of the rule of law, democracy, and good governance in Africa. When President Barack Obama was sworn in for his first term as President of the United States of America, there was tremendous goodwill and hope, particularly among Africans, that the President, being of African descent, will pay more attention to our continent. Very early in his first tenure, President Obama visited Africa to underscore the continent's importance to the US and gave a historic speech in front of the Ghanaian parliament in 2009. that generated great expectations as to how the US viewed Africa. It clearly sounded like a call to action and set forth the foundation and basic principles that will govern the relationship based on mutual respect, mutual responsibility, and common interest. To engage Africa even further, President Obama hosted more than 40 heads of state from Africa in August this year in Washington, D.C. This was the US-Africa Leaders Summit, the first of its kind, under the theme, Investing in the Future Generation. It was a unique opportunity to launch a long overdue active and comprehensive dialogue between the US and Africa. The summit redefined the strategic orientation of forward-looking partnership between the US and Africa, based on equality, mutual respect, and common interest. Indeed, the summit provided an enduring and momentous opportunity for both sides to pursue mutually beneficial interests. Africa's global relevance and influence has become significant to the strategic and national interests of the US. Therefore, we welcome the US proactive engagement with Africa in ensuring peace and stability in many parts of the continent and encouraging the promotion of sustainable democratic systems which are fundamental to the economic and social development of many Africans. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now talk about my own country, Namibia. Participatory democracy through universal suffrage only came to Namibia at independence in 1990. Before that, the country was occupied by a repressive regime, the apartheid regime of South Africa, which ruled the country through the segregation of our people based on race. The regime committed heinous atrocities against the people of Namibia. In order to understand democracy in Namibia, it is important to accentuate briefly on the history of the country. From 1884, Namibia was a German colony and was even called German Southwest Africa. After the First World War, the League of Nations mandated South Africa to administer the territory. Following World War II, the League of Nations Following World War II, the League of Nations was dissolved in April 1946, and its successor, the United Nations, instituted a trusteeship system to bring all the former German colonies in Africa under the UN control in order to prepare them for independence with majority rule. South Africa objected to the trusteeship system, arguing that a majority of the territory's people were content with South African rule. And this was not true. They refused to cooperate because they wanted to annex Southwest Africa completely. And after the ultra-racist Nationalist Party won the South African elections in 1948, they further imposed the brutal apartheid system on Namibia. Peaceful protests were illegal under the apartheid regime. In 1959, the colonial forces in Windhoek, the capital city of Namibia, sought to remove black residents further away from the white area of town. The residents protested peacefully, but they were met with brute force, resulting in the subsequent killing of 11 protesters and others wounded. This led to the formation of United Black Opposition to protest the forced removal of the people from one part of the city to the other. It also galvanized support to protest and fight against South African rule. Internationally, a number of petitions were submitted to the United Nations calling for South Africa to grant Namibian independence. In 1971, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion declaring South Africa's continued occupation of Namibia illegal. Most African countries and the members of the non-aligned movement supported Namibia's struggle for independence. Countries such as the Soviet Union, India, and China also supported Namibia's struggle for independence. Unfortunately, the US and other Western powers were on the wrong side of history and contributed to the delay of Namibia's independence through their support to the apartheid regime of South Africa and by vetoing United Nations Security Council resolutions on Namibia. Well, let bygones be bygones, and we are now good friends. When all peaceful efforts failed, Namibians had no other alternative but to take up arms in order to liberate the country. Thus, in August 1966, SWAPO launched the War of Liberation in Namibia. The struggle for independence intensified and continued until South Africa was forced to agree in 1988 to end its apartheid administration and implement the UN Security Council Resolution 435 of 1978. We lost many brave Namibians during the struggle. Those people sacrificed their souls to liberate Namibia. As we say, their blood waters our freedom. After democratic elections were held in 1989, Namibia became an independent state on March 21st, 1990. When the founding president of Namibia, Dr. Sam Nujoma, was inaugurated as the first president of an independent Namibia, he declared that, and I quote, "As from today, we are masters of this vast land of our ancestors. The destiny of this country is now fully in our own hands. Taking the destiny of this country in our own hands means, among other things, making the great effort to forge national identity and unity. Our collective security and prosperity depends on our unity of purpose and action. Unity is a precondition for peace and development. Without peace, it is not possible for the best and talented citizens of our country to realize their potential." End of quote. The leaders of Namibia preferred democracy over authoritarianism. They preferred reconciliation over confrontation with their former enemies. In this regard, the new leaders adopted the policy of national reconciliation, which was highly praised nationally and internationally. This policy was the precursor to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Namibia boasts a proud 24 years record of uninterrupted peace and stability for all to enjoy. Institutional democracy in Namibia is sound and functioning like in any other democratic society. We truly believe in democracy, understanding that democracy is a system of government in which power is vested in the people, who rule either directly or through freely elected representatives. In this regard, Namibia is built on strong democratic foundations with people's participation in the democratic process. All institutions necessary to ensure democratic governance have been established. National and presidential elections are conducted freely and fairly and are held every 5 years. Regional and local authority elections are also held regularly. As a matter of fact, presidential and parliamentary elections will be held in Namibia next week, on November 28, 2014. Our presidents only served 2 5-year terms. Article 29 of the Constitution clearly states that a person shall hold office as president for not more than 2 terms. The current president, President Vigapunye Pohamba, has honorably served his 2 terms and decided to step down and not seek another term in office, which by any measure would have required a constitutional amendment. This is good news out of Africa, but unfortunately to the Western media, good news from Africa is no news. It is important to point out that democracy is far more than just elections. It requires independent institutions, the rule of law, unperturbed freedoms, active and effective civil society, and free press. Namibia's constitution entrenches multi-party democracy and fundamental human rights and freedoms. Our constitution ensures that the executive, the legislative and judiciary branches of government are independent and autonomous. The government of Namibia has remained steadfast in its commitment to freedom of expression, respect for human rights, and freedom of the press. We have institutions in place that govern the conduct of government, its agencies, and the private sector. Among them are the Anti-Corruption Commission, the ACC, and the Office of the Ombudsman. The Anti-Corruption Commission is mandated to combat and prevent corruption through law enforcement, educating the public, and enlisting their support against corruption and providing advisory services. The Commission examines practices, systems, and procedures of public and private bodies to facilitate the discovery of corrupt practices and to secure the revision of practices, systems, and procedures that may become prone or conducive to corrupt practices. The Ombudsman receives complaints from any citizen who feels wronged by any organization or institution, including government, and investigates and gives proper remedies to the grievance. These institutions represent what Abraham Lincoln referred to as government of the people, by the people, for the people. The government of Namibia is indeed of the people, by the people, and for the people of Namibia. I would like to take this opportunity to invite all of you to consider visiting Namibia and to enjoy the endless horizons, clear skies, wildlife, adventure, and local food and culture. Unfortunately, you will have to buy your own tickets. But the good news is that when going to Namibia as a tourist, you don't need a visa. You can just pack your bags and go to the airport, with your ticket, of course. In conclusion, I would like to say more Africans these days accept that being able to genuinely choose their leaders is the least bad way to freedom and prosperity. Namibia is proof of that. Many African countries held elections this year, among them South Africa, Botswana, Malawi, Madagascar, and Mozambique. All these elections were declared free and fair by local and international observers. I have no doubt that Namibia's presidential and parliamentary elections taking place next week will be free and fair. This is testimony that democracy in Africa is steadfast, albeit with varying challenges in some cases. Ultimately, the success of our continental efforts and democratization will depend largely on the extent to which we as Africans continue to determine, influence, and shape our own development agenda and strengthen our democratic institutions and political systems. I want to thank you very much for your attention. I was a little long, but no, speaking on behalf of the government, you have to make sure that you convey the message as it is. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ambassador Anjaba has graciously agreed to take a few questions from the audience. So if you would stand, I think we have a hand microphone. Oh, we have a microphone in the back. So if you would just go to the microphone and address your questions, you could do so. I'll start out, Mr. Ambassador, by just indicating, first of all, thank you very much for what was a very instructive lecture. It's really enlightening. It helped us not only to understand your the countries, your neighbors, and specifically Namibia, but help us to really understand our own and the role that we played or opportunities we did not take advantage of in the emergence of the independence of Namibia. But and as we reflect on that, it was clear that we were associating ourselves with another side and other forces. And the forces at that time seemed to have been communism, that it was easier to sort of label everything emerging out of Africa as communism that would automatically make the United States opposed to it. How much did that really play in delaying the recognition of the independence of Namibia?
Yes, it's true that communism was used by the Western countries to try and label the liberation movements and make them look bad in the eyes of the world. We were not communists, as far as SWAPO is concerned. We were not communists. But we had to find somebody to help us. We were in that situation where we needed assistance. And the countries that were ready to come to our assistance happened to be from Eastern Europe. So we took that assistance which they gave us and used it to free ourselves. If it was not for that, we would probably still be a colonial country. But I must also point out that although we did not receive support from the administrations of the Western countries, we received support from the people. There were anti-apartheid movements or groups and solidarity groups here in the US, in the UK, very strong, in France and so on. Our leaders, I was a very young officer then, when I accompanied my leaders to these countries, addressing anti-apartheid groups and support groups. We would leave this country with a lot of money, a lot of medicine, and educational material, and clothing, and food. But the administration here did not give us any support. But that did not prevent us from moving ahead and forging ahead with our struggle, because we knew what we wanted, and we knew that we were going to achieve our independence no matter what. It was just a question of time.
We have a question in the back, please.
Thank you for addressing us from a perspective we don't ordinarily get to hear. I wonder if you would address the question of how to deal with governments that resist democratic standards and indeed defy electoral mandates, in particular the question of withdrawal of recognition and perhaps externally sponsored removal, particularly in reference to what happened in Cote d'Ivoire a few years ago, where the government won 46% of the vote, was defeated by all external measures, but sought to discount voting in parts of the country that were opposed to the president, and he sought to remain in power, and foreign forces were decisive in ousting the president of Cote d'Ivoire, who's now on trial at the ICC. I wonder whether you see that as a positive kind of direction for African democracy, or whether it's actually a setback for African democracy.
Thank you very much. I did mention in my address the AU governance architecture. And it has now become the practice that if a government comes to power through a coup or through illegal means, that government will not be recognized. The AU will always suspend that government. So will also be the regional body. In this case, ECOWAS also suspended Cote d'Ivoire and many other countries that came to office through coups. So in the case of Cote d'Ivoire, I think there were some issues that were discussed there, and it was actually discovered that the president who you said now is facing trial by the ICC had problems, and therefore he was not accepted by the rest of the AU as being legitimate. So the process was then redone, sort of, to allow the democratic dispensation to take place. But otherwise, as a policy, fundamental policy of the African Union, no government would be accepted if they took over through a coup or illegal means. The regional groupings would do the same. It has happened with many countries in Africa. For example, Burkina Faso, there was an incident now, and a deadline was given. Of course, Burkinabe people are explaining that there was no coup, but the AU has put up a deadline to say, no, if you don't go through the transitional period to allow the soldiers to go back to the barracks, we will impose sanctions by this date. So that is working. We isolate them. That is now the position of Africa. We isolate them, and they'll feel the pinch. And then they'll be forced to come back through the democratic process. So I think this is the way we think as Africans will be able to handle those that to take over through military coups.
Other questions? Yes. While you're coming to the microphone, in interviewing 3 or 4 presidents in Africa, different countries in Africa, they've all estimated that when you ask the question,
how many countries are practicing true democracy, mentioned somewhere around 23, always about half of the 54 countries on the continent. My question to you, Mr. Ambassador, is that's not a high mark. What do you estimate in terms of time that it takes a country from independence to actually getting to a level of democracy that Africans accept, not by Western standards, by the definition you gave in your lecture?
Well, I don't think it would be proper to give any deadline on this matter. These are processes that take the course, sometimes not really in the control or in the hands of those that are in power, because there will be other external factors. But in our case, in Namibia, the democracy in Namibia started the moment we arrived in Windhoek. And it's going on now, still. Yeah. So what happens in one country may not necessarily be applicable to another country. But it all also depends on the political commitment of the leaders in that particular country to want to bring improvement for their own people.
A minute back.
When you speak about democracy, and I'd like to know what type of role can your country play in helping straighten out the situation in
Somalia. I recall when the conflict in Somalia started, we were still a young country, but we were requested to contribute troops to the peacekeeping mission in Somalia. It wasn't easy for us because we were still establishing ourselves, so we did not send troops. What we did was to participate through the African Union in support of the efforts to bring about peace and reconciliation in Somalia. And we continue to do so. We, up to now, have not sent troops. There's an AU mission deployed in Somalia, but we are contributing through financial, contributions and others. And even at the meetings of the AU, we participate actively. So I think we can only do it that way until the people of Somalia themselves will be ready to get together. Because otherwise, it's ultimately their responsibility to bring peace to their country. Otherwise, those of us who are there are just assisting. We cannot impose, we cannot force them to reconcile. But we are there to assist the process. We fully support the mission that has been deployed to Somalia. We give financial contributions to that peacekeeping mission.
What about in your mind? Is there a certain timetable that you could probably see, or?
Can you repeat that again, please?
In your mind, your personal opinion, in your mind, do you see a timetable where this can probably be, cleared up in Somalia?
Well, it's difficult. Timetable, you put them, they may not work. So it's not easy to put an artificial timetable to a process of this nature. So what is important is for this country, people in this country, to get together and work hard for peace in their own country. And then, of course, for this international community to support. I know the UN also supports financially and so on. But what is important here is the people of Somalia themselves to lead the process and determine their own future.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you again very, very much for coming and doing this.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to give you just a few things. You know Detroit probably as well as anyone who visits here, but we have a Reveal Your Detroit book for you to take away even those late nights when you're waiting for the cables from Namibia. You may very well want to read this as you're, and we have a little memento of Wayne State with our seal on it, a piece of Coebic tile, and we'd like for you to keep that as well as a memento of the university.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you once again. for inviting me and my colleague.
Yeah.
And thank you for the warm hospitality
Well,
that we have enjoyed.
Well, you certainly deserve it. You've been wonderful and supportive of us. And we will see you in Windhoek in March, and we'll spend some time visiting other parts of the country as well.